Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and this is a follow-up video to a video I did recently that you do not need to watch in order to enjoy this one. But I want to talk about playing fair and, on the very rare occasions that it's relevant, how to spot when someone's not playing fairly with you. In part one, which I will link down below in the description of this video, you can see a lot of the sort of pre-game conversations and things that I want to talk about as being really useful for Warcry. In this video, I'm going to talk more about how you conduct yourself during the flow of a game and also what to do at the end of a game. Quick, do some clarifications on the other one. I've, throughout the history of this channel, made a lot of ado about dice, which is something that some people get really into, finding out that dice are not random and wanting to deal with it. Other people are just like, I'm just going to throw the dice that are in front of me. I get that. So when I talk about things like, for example, when you have non-random dice that you are using for your initiative roll, that's actually a slight advantage for you. And when you have non-random dice that you're using for your attack rolls, that is, it can be an advantage for you. It is usually actually a disadvantage, just based on how dice end up getting non-randomized. And so when you use your non-random dice for your initiative rolls, but not your attack rolls, that's kind of a red flag, right? So people talk about, having some different colored dice for different types of rolls. That's not a big deal if they're all the same, right? Or if you just have every single dice is a different dice, that's not really a big deal as far as, red flags or not. What is sort of a bit of a red flag there is when you are sort of clearly using your non-random dice for your initiative rolls and then some really immaculate dice for your attack rolls. That's where it can become a problem. Previous video I did, I talked about sort of tracking things like wounds and activations and things like that. And one thing that I do think for tracking wounds, you can get into a lot of trouble if you track them off board. But a comment that a couple people made to me was that actually if you number your bases, it's very in vogue to just have completely black rimmed base. But if you just number your identical chaff models or you even name them and then you track by name, that actually does solve the problem. If you do want to track everything off board, you can do that if you're giving everyone names and giving the names on the bases and then tying the names to a sheet that you track on. That can work. And another thing about this video series is these types of videos that are, not really about necessarily the meta or only really apply to people who end up in a situation where they're playing against someone they don't know, which would be large tournaments, which most of the community doesn't go to large tournaments. These types of videos tend to be very high effort and very low reward. So if you're interested in this type of content, talking about how to play fair, how to treat fairly with your opponent and, stand up for yourself if you don't think that they're treating you fairly, consider leaving a comment, hitting a like, consider joining the Patreon. That's a place where I workshop a lot of these ideas, and I would not be able to do these types of videos if the Patreon didn't exist. YouTube just does not like this type of content where you put a lot of thought into it and then it's useful to a smaller subset of your viewers than, what are the 20 best fighters in Warcry, right? So I will be doing some pretty fun, lower effort, higher reward, higher audience videos in the future. But I do think that these types of sort of community-based videos are really important. And so I want to be able to highlight these and talk about these subjects. So let's get right into it. And the first one, we're going to start with the hardest thing to talk about of all of these topics, and it's going to be measuring and specifically fudge factor when measuring. Perfect measurements are literally impossible, even in online games. I've played enough online games now to know that perfect measurements don't even happen online. So at a certain point while you're playing, you have to live with a certain measure of fudge, right? Because people bump models, people, have a tough time positioning their ruler, things like that. And it's very difficult, I've tried, to explain here's what level of precision I like to measure at, right? It makes you sound like a doof. It often like raises alarm bells in the other person's head of like, well, I'm gonna, screw you over in this way because this is my level of precision and this is where I'm fudgy, right? It's going to raise alarm bells in their head, even though what you're trying to do is like be as transparent as possible. So I find it very difficult to really talk about in the pregame conversation. But at the end of the day, you can't really play Warcry or any war game if you don't have what I would call a reciprocal margin for error. And by that, I mean essentially that you and your opponent are playing with a fairly equal level of precision. So if a measurement is tight, you're going to have to allow your opponent a chance to, help you figure out if it's legal. And if they aren't doing the same for you, that's really tough. A big red flag that I have seen more than just against one opponent, against quite a few different matchups is if someone is policing your every move, and then they start measuring fast and loose, that's a real big red flag. I do find in war games a lot that the sort of fudge factor with measurements is a big decider of who wins games. And a lot of good players can often just be people who move very aggressively. I'll give you a not Warcry example. I was watching a 40K battle report once, and it's one of the most, I know it's one of the 2 or 3 most famous 40K battle report channels, but it was one because someone, one of the 2 people kind of shoved their Necrons up the board significantly further than they are allowed to go, but just like being fast and loose while talking to the camera, while the other person kind of just inched his Space Marines up the board while measuring tightly and not addressing the camera while he talked, essentially. And the Necron player won because of that, because he ended up getting like 10 more Necrons into a very important combat on the objective that then killed a couple more Space Marines than he would have been able to kill otherwise, etc., blah, blah, blah. And people on the channel said, oh, this is bullshit, like so-and-so, he always does this and he always wins. And it's like, war games shouldn't be won and lost because of a non-reciprocal fudge factor, but they often are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of very concrete types of measurements, but it's impossible to be all-inclusive there. And it is very, very important to learn how to be precise, how to be legal with your measurements, and how to very kind of gently guide the opponent towards giving you the same amount of leeway you give them, and you give them the same amount of leeway they give you, right? Because a lot of close games come down to millimeters of like what is a legal position to be able to attack this fighter but not that fighter. And so if you aren't sort of communicating well, that's how arguments start up at the end of close games. And we don't want those. So this is sort of going to be the catch-all term that is the hardest to really communicate about, but really try your very best to be very demonstrative about how you measure, to be open with your opponent about checking your measurements, and to stand up for yourself if your opponent doesn't want you checking their measurements. It can add a little bit of time to games. So what I would say is just quickly move through it while showing them and practice the actual like hand-eye coordination that is required there to be able to do it, because I think that's important. Now let's get into kind of an actual example, and this is the place where I think people fudge their measurements the most, and that's rounding corners. So I have here a diagram. This blue circle is trying to take out this red circle by getting close to it. And almost everyone, the first 20 times they measure, almost everyone I see measures this way, where the closest part of the blue circle goes straight to the corner and then straight to the red circle. I had an opponent just very recently who is a very good player who has played a lot, who was doing this. And it was funny at the end of the game, I was having a tough time communicating to them that they were not allowed to make these moves. But then I realized that they had been like mumbling about moves that, and like playing around moves that I could have made around corners, slingshotting around corners essentially to take out their fighters. And I'd been like, why the hell is he playing around that? I obviously am not allowed to make that. So he wasn't like cheating. He legitimately thought you could do this, and he thought that I could do it too. And it's not legal for either player. The side of your base has to be able to clear the corner too, right? Your base is a sort of full obstacle on the board, and you can't act as if it's only, a 1 millimeter radius dot. And so if you just measure from the front and then straight to your objective, you're essentially giving yourself often like +2 movement, depending on how big your base is. Luckily, there's a few different ways to really quickly resolve this that don't take any longer to measure than the main piece. The first is if you just measure straight lines, you can measure from the side of your base to the corner. So you can see here, I've put the arrow at a very different part of the circle, and that's going to be a longer distance, but that gets the inside of your base to the corner. And then you're going to have to measure the angle, of course, because you won't be able to just go straight. Then you'll cut off the back of your base. So you'll have to then move at an obtuse angle to get the back of your base clear of the corner. And then you can move straight towards your opponent. So it's sort of a 3-move piece instead of a 2-move piece, but it's still pretty quick because you just sort of put it down, put it down, put it down. It doesn't really take much longer, and it's pretty straightforward. It will cost you move. This, if you line up these 2 arrows versus these 3 arrows, the 3 arrows are significantly longer. I actually did this before the video to make sure I wasn't lying to you all. And the 3 arrows are, about like 20% longer than the 2 arrows were. So this does cost you move, but it is a legal way to get around the corner that this one isn't. Another legal way to do it is actually way faster than either of these, but it requires a bendy ruler to do. And that's why I love the bendy rulers that come in the Warcry starter set. But you can know what the radius is of your base, and you can just give yourself that much clearance. And then you can just do a one-time measure between the closest part of your base and your opponent, and you can just bend around the corner. That's completely legal, right? Because your radius is still clearing the corner because you are bending around this kind of imaginary outside corner. A lot of the time, you will have a dice that is about equal to the radius of your base, and so that will allow you to do it. Things like a little paint pot can really help, right? Like this paint pot is pretty close to the size of this 32 millimeter base, so on like something like a big 50 millimeter hammer piece, this is actually going to be your radius, is going to be the size of this paint pot, stuff like that. And then you just bend your move around the paint pot as close as you can, and you get there. And it's perfectly legal, takes the same amount of time, probably less time actually than doing this 2-piece move, and it's great. I also want to talk about one of the first things I see almost every new player doing wrong. This is one that people generally stop doing once they see their opponent doing it. And let's talk about, so I have this pen is going to stand in for a ruler. And if you see me look down at the pen, there is an angle here that the space on the board that is taken up by said pen is much bigger than the pen was, right? Because if it's close to you, the angle from your eye to one side of it and the angle from your eye to the other side of it is going to then become a trapezoid and stop you from, having the correct measurement. So the biggest way to sort of fix this is to measure as close to the battlefield as you can possibly get. The current terrain is really hard for this. Gnarlwood terrain is a nightmare for doing this because you often can't get down to the battlefield. Big long spears that catch on things are a nightmare for doing this. But something that can help a lot with this is like short sticks. So things like the kill team sticks that they give you, stuff like that can fit into areas that you otherwise can't fit into. AOS combat gauges are really useful for this. Taylor's measuring tape is really useful for this because you can just kind of drop it down and then pull it, things like that. But anytime you can just measure from the battlefield. The other thing you can do if you can't get down there is, and this is why I don't have some of these things. So what I've begun doing is I put a stick down vertically where I'm starting or where I want to try to get to. And then I measure this way so that I'm not trying to get over it and eyeball it, but you put the stick down, you put another one at a right angle to it, and then you measure, and then you can put your eyeball just over that and go straight down. So that way you're not creating the trapezoid, you at least have an actual real right angle. I also think that this piece of art is really, really cool. So amazing. But those are kind of two really common sort of places where I see people fall down in measurements and measure incorrectly, measure illegally, and give themselves often pretty sizable illegal advantages. Again, this is something where this isn't just like a couple rude cheaters that I've seen do this. This is just a lot of people who maybe don't know about how you're supposed to do this. And I just want to jump in here to say that because this is something that plagues new players so much, I really don't think it behooves you to sort of get up in your opponent's face trying to correct them about this, but to try to be very gentle and to just keep in mind that this is something that decides a lot of games between pretty experienced players, that it shouldn't, in a way that it's maybe a little bit less important that new players get it right away. But it's just something to be very aware of, especially as you sort of advance deeper in a tournament and you see, some of your opponents might be pretty chill about their measurements. Some opponents might be very aggressive in a way that you need to, just be very precise about and help them understand what's legal and what isn't. Let's talk about clock management. Another bit of a dicey one. And I'll start with clock hogging. Given enough time, an experienced player will find the correct perfect play. Warcry is a very complicated game, but it's not so complicated that it's not solvable. It's not like some games with hidden information. There is perfect information. If you took out your calculator and got all of the onboard information, you would eventually figure out the perfect play for every single move that you make. The thing about that is that to do that requires a lot of time. And I think it's worth taking a second here to talk about why people do this and to do so in maybe an empathetic manner. Because the first reason, I think, for a lot of people taking a really long time to make their decisions is because they're unconfident and new at the game. And I will always defend your right to be bad at Warcry. It's very reasonable to not spend all of your time obsessing about the game, right? It's very reasonable to be new at a game. Everyone was new at something once, right? And so people can usually tell if you are doing this because you're new versus if you're doing this because you're perfect. And I would hope that most TOs, most opponents would be willing to be patient with you. The one advice I would say to people who are kind of new, who are having a tough time finishing their games on time when they play, or having maybe even in just their casual games, or having a tough time getting their games done in under 90 minutes, is just free yourself up to make mistakes. The best way to maybe learn from mistakes is to make them and then really analyze your games afterwards. Where this, I think, matters more is with more experienced players. I once watched a very helpful Haywo Twitch video, actually, where he talked about how it is very rare to see people who are purposefully clock hogging for advantage. It does happen. There are people who will play very slowly, and then when it's the other person's turn, remind that person that there is a short amount of time remaining, and then on their turn play very slowly and like weaponize the round time limit in that way. Those people do exist, but they are very, very rare. What is much more common is people sort of experienced players accidentally getting an unfair advantage from this. So it's best to be somewhat gentle with people who are having this problem, but basically a lot of pretty experienced players can see all of the complex things at hand in a game, but maybe are at a point where they're not really willing to make those big obvious mistakes. They want to play well. Or in other situations, they might see all of the variables at hand, but maybe not be quite at the level where they know which two variables are the most important that they can prioritize. And so they just end up prioritizing all of them. You can kind of get bogged down in an analysis paralysis. You can see people who measure the distance between the model they're about to move and like every single model on the board, and you simply cannot do that and finish your games in a reasonable amount of time. Even though I get it, you're an experienced player, you know that these are the things that matter. You need to know these things about where your fighter is. But the fact is, you simply cannot confirm these things and finish your game in a reasonable amount of time. So you have to make guesstimates. You have to be willing to give up that level of control to be courteous to your opponent and to finish your games during a reasonable time frame. Those are the types of players who I think need to be guided with this the most and sort of given the feedback that they are taking too much time. A way to kind of think about this, an 8-model warband should expect to activate about 24 times in a 70-minute game of Warcry. Your later rounds will take less time. Round 2 should take the most time because that's the most activations, but you could expect to activate 24 times. If you take 90 seconds per activation, you will take up so much of your clock that your opponent cannot reasonably be expected to consider their plays and still finish the game on time, right? So there is a certain way in which if you take up the majority of the time on the clock, you're kind of doing a discourtesy to your opponent because you are essentially asking them to play worse in order to cover for you to get you to the time limit legally, right? Which is not great. So one thing that I've talked to some folks who know that they're slow players is just you get to play a more elite warband, and then you can still consider your full plays and not have to worry about how much time you're taking up, right? One thing that I find really useful, because I play a lot of semi-swarm warbands, I play a lot of 9-model warbands, a lot of 10-model warbands. I like to practice a couple times with my chaff and get a sense for how that chaff plays, and then create a heuristic for how each chaff unit is supposed to approach different types of matchups. Not very many. I'm not doing this like by faction. I'm doing this by like the type of game we're playing, right? And the more experienced you get, the more you'll be able to kind of break that out for yourself. But generally then I try to take the same approach, the same attitude with each chaff model. If I'm like, my chaff wants to be trying to bully their chaff this game, then I will just like quickly push my chaff towards their chaff. Trying to keep it away from their big hammers, but pushing it towards their chaff the whole game. And I won't think too much about it because I'll just know that 85% of the time that's the correct move. So that's what I'm just going to do 98% of the time. You know, the only other time being when it's like really obviously wrong, right? In a different situation, I might think like, my chaff's job is to survive here. That's it. That's all they have to do is survive. So I'm just going to be running away with them all the time. And there are, though, you will miss the equity from the one time when you could have, you know, entrapped their hammer so that it would try to kill one of your chaff and fail, and then your hammer would come in and, you know, take it off the board and, you know, maybe trap their dragons so that your titans can get onto them. Shout outs to everyone who doesn't like jargon, stuff like that. You'll miss that equity, but you will get your 10 model rounds done on time. And that is the important thing. And the more practiced you get with your faction, the more complex your heuristics will be in your head, right? But you're going to want to still be kind of on autopilot with your chaff, because not doing so kind of becomes this clock hogging discourtesy to your opponent. And if you do manage to position your chaff quickly, that's really nice, because then you can actually take your time as far as how you actually use the really important pieces in your warband and get the perfect play with those, right? If you take 2 minutes every single time you activate, your big, terrifying, I don't have anything big and terrifying within reach. Here's the biggest model I've got within reach. Your Knight Relictor. If you take 2 minutes every time to think about what you want to do with that, but you just like burn through your Blood Reaver activations really quick, that can work out fine, right? And you can still get a huge percentage of your value while still getting your game done on time. This is also something that I think TOs need to be very aware of, is if someone doesn't finish on time for 2 rounds in a row, I think that warnings for slow play are a part of every single other tabletop game. Every single tabletop game that is well run and has an established tournament scene has warnings for slow play that can happen, right? And we don't, and it's a very small scene, so I think for most tournaments it shouldn't matter. But for some of them, I think it's very reasonable for a TO. In an event that I would run, if I had a player who had gone to time and then a future player that they were playing sort of raises their hand and says, like, my opponent is taking too long to consider their plays, I would consider, depending on the severity of the infraction, I would consider a warning. That would probably be it. Or I would do -1 wild dice in their next round. Or, at a certain point, you do need to be able to consider a game loss if you think it's in bad faith or something, but that's very, very rare. I've only seen one person do that, and in that situation, it was much more of this, which I would call point stalling. If you are winning, it is extremely poor form to stall the clock on purpose. It shouldn't have to be something that I explain as being bad, but I think a lot of people don't know that this exists or don't know that it happens. And does it happen on purpose? I think that's very rare, but does it happen on accident? I actually don't think it's that rare. I think some people, when they have a lead, they don't want to screw it up and they seize up a little bit. And that's not good. Don't do that. Because you are robbing your opponent of the chance to catch up, right? If you are winning and you are playing slow, you are cheating is a strong word, because again, I don't think very many people do this on purpose, although I have heard of one person who has. I don't think, it's just very easy to do this by accident, and it's not good. And you're just like cheating your opponent out of their opportunity to come back in the game. So if your opponent is winning and their pace of play noticeably slows down, that is a real red flag, and you should immediately raise your hand, immediately tell the TO. And the worst thing that happens, the TO, well, some TOs might be like, all right, guys, just settle it up, quicken up, and just walk away, which would be too bad. Hopefully your TO would take it seriously, but I think most would, and I think most experienced players understand that this is not great. Almost every timed game, it's illegal to stall on purpose if you have a lead. It's, in Magic, it's considered very scummy, although it's very hard to enforce. But it's illegal almost everywhere where there are timed games, and it should be illegal in Warcry too. I think if your tournament pack doesn't say it, if there's a lot of people who don't know each other and you want to just make sure that everyone is getting the same fair chance to win, I think it is worth bringing it up to the TO at the beginning of the tournament if you don't see it in the kind of fine print of the tournament pack. Generally, round 2, like I said before, should be the longest round in the game. Sometimes it'll be round 1, like if 2 deployment groups are setting up and you really have to think through exactly what your opponent's capable of. But usually it's going to be round 2, because that's where the most fighters are on the board. There's just the most people have just shown up from reserves, and not very many have died yet, and so that's going to take a long time. But if round 3 is taking longer than round 2, it's reasonable to try to hustle your opponent up a little bit, to remind your opponent that you have a clock. Don't hustle them up. Remind them that they have a clock, and practice how you would say this in a nice way. It's kind of dorky, but just like think about it in your head, especially if you think they're being kind of slow in round 2. Think about in your head how you will address it in round 3. And that can be a really important way to kind of stand up for yourself and to keep everything just kind of playing above board. One way that you can deal with this is through chess clocks. A lot of people hate chess clocks. I won't spend a lot of time on this. They are not as scary as you think. You move your fighter, you click it, they move their fighter, they click it, you move your fighter up, announce, hey, I'm going to attack. Do you want to react? Click. They go, no, I don't want to react. Click. Roll my dice. Here's how much damage I'm going to deal. Click. Let them write down the damage, and it's their turn, right? It actually goes really smoothly. It doesn't go smoothly through initiative rolls, so what I would say is have the clock pause in between rounds and have it be a combat phase only clock, and so have, say, 30 minutes on each player's combat phase timer, and that takes up an hour, so that leaves 10 minutes for initiative rolls. You could say maybe 33 minutes for a timer, because that's 66 minutes with 4 minutes left. That's not enough time if both players go to time, but usually if one player hits 33 while another is just on like 26, something like that. And for people who do tend to stall and who tend to clock hog, that's really what it's going to look like, is you're going to hit 33 when your other opponent is like in the mid 20s. In that situation, you can just you're out of time, and you can just say you're activated out for the rest of the game. The opponent doesn't automatically win. You just don't get any more activations. And that would be very rare to happen, because you would see once you're in the late 20s, you would see you don't really have much time left, and you would just go a lot faster. And then, you just leave yourself that extra time for things like board setup and initiative rolls, things like that, which only take a couple minutes if people are being efficient. So for 95% of players, periodic time checks are perfectly adequate. But I really do think about 1 in 20 players need this. And there is a real hesitance, I think, among the community to demand a chess clock, to bring a chess clock to events. I get that. I get all the reasons why. But it's really not that scary once you play with it. And might be worthwhile to just have one at your event and offer it up. Let's talk about post-game conversations. And these are hard. Most of the time they're really easy. I shouldn't say they're hard. Most of the time they're really easy. But if something does come up, they're really hard. There was a little bit of talk about someone who was just a very rude and difficult opponent at the last Warhammer World thing, and who may have been making illegal wound counter decisions, purposefully obfuscating which of their fighters had taken how many wounds in order to confuse their opponents and bait their opponents into attacking fighters that were not the ones that they should have been trying to attack, things like that. And they were just like very rude generally. And so that is really hard to deal with, right? How much do you say to the TO right afterwards? And I do want to encourage people, most of the games you'll play 20 games before you have the one game against someone who is like this. But unfortunately, it does happen sometimes, and the bigger Warcry gets, the more likely this is to happen. So don't be afraid to mention it to the TO. If you sort of didn't like how a game goes, it's not on you to police your opponent, really. I just talked about like some specific ways in which you need to stand up for yourself if an opponent is playing in a way that's unfair to you. But I get it. I've had opponents who I didn't like how they were acting, and I didn't really say much during the time, or I was having a communication barrier with them. I couldn't get through to them what was going on, and so I just sort of let it slide and just sort of threw my hands up. It's okay to sort of back down and maybe not get the result you wanted, and then tell the TO afterwards that you don't think that your opponent was being fair to you. I don't think that you owe, if an opponent's really rude to you or like really badgering you or just like being really confrontational, you don't owe that opponent like a man-to-man conversation. You know, like I think that's really toxic when people are a little bit abusive and then they find that people don't like them and they're like, well, why didn't anyone confront me with this? And it's like, because you're being abusive to them. You're being a terrible person. Why would they like come up and confront you and do that emotional labor just to subject themselves to your abuse? Again, you don't owe a rude or cheating opponent any kind of person-to-person conversation to let them mend their ways. That's like old 1950s shit that's made up by like the worst people in the world to enable their own abuse. So just tell the TO and try to be concrete if you can. This is one of the hardest things, right? Because a lot of the time, if someone's not being fair towards you, you might get emotionally flooded. You might not write down the things that they did that were not fair. You might just feel too flustered and not be able to get the concrete things. So, if someone is just being really rude to you, maybe just explain in between rounds, like, hey, I need to just like go get some water or something, and just like cool off, come back, and just like note the things that they are doing that are not cool that you can talk about. So, one of the times when I was not treated fairly by an opponent, I was really lucky because of the game I was winning by a lot, and they were cheating in order to get back in the game. So they're in a very tough emotional situation where they, I think, really thought they were going to win. And because I'm kind of a recognizable face, there's like a bounty on me at every tournament. So like, it's cool if you can beat the really recognizable person. So I think they really, really wanted to win. And so they started just really blatantly cheating, honestly. And I wasn't necessarily as flustered as I would have been if it was like a really close game that I was worried about losing. So I was able to write it down, some of the things that they were doing that were not legal. The problem was afterwards, I was really upset because they were cheating and they were really mean to me. And so I was really upset that it kind of tainted my win in my feelings. And so I didn't tell the TO because I didn't want to be the person who won and then accuse someone of cheating and then have it all like, it felt like bullying to me, even though I had felt bullied in the game. And so I didn't tell the TO that the person had cheated. And in my tournament report, I just mentioned how rude they were. And it really like became a disaster because people were like, how could, like, if all they were was rude, like you should just be able to take it and move on because, hey, you won. And like I hadn't talked about how bad it was, and then this person went and cheated again. And so what I should have done is gone to the TO afterwards and just said, hey, just so you know, my opponent did this, and this, and they did a whole bunch of things that I thought were shady, but there were 3 that I at least like saw, wrote down, and could say concretely, right? They said that the ogre reaction, which is if the opponent makes an attack action and there are no crits, you deal them 3 and you heal 3. And they represented that the ogre reaction was actually just a flat deal 3, heal 3 before damage rolls. And they also had Bushwhack as man trap, and they represented it as if you could just like drop it on a fighter and it would instantly blow up the second that fighter moved, which is obviously untrue. It would be the most powerful ability in the game if that were true. And so both of these abilities, they represented differently than they were in order to gain an advantage. And then they also did the slingshot around corners thing that I had talked about earlier in the video. And so if I had just like talked about that to the TO, maybe he doesn't do anything, right? But at least that gives him an opportunity to censure that player, to give some kind of consequence to that player, at which point, in my opinion, if someone does something illegal and they get a consequence for it, to me, it no longer really feels like as bad of cheating necessarily, because it's like this way, if you set up clear rules, like this happens in Magic all the time, right? People receive game losses for like not having one of the cards in their deck, right? But that can happen where you just like accidentally drop a card while you're shuffling, and it's just known like, hey, you need to be precise while you play, and if you break the rules and you take this consequence, usually it's not a game loss, but you break the rules, you take this consequence, and then if you're the kind of person who's like not trying to be shady about it and not throwing temper tantrums about it, people generally go, okay, that happens. Sloppy people get hit with these sometimes from time to time. Even precise people are sloppy sometimes. And, people generally will forgive someone if that person has faced consequences to their actions, much more likely than they are if someone is just like doing this as a pattern and never facing any consequences. And so by not telling the TO and not mentioning the actual cheats in my tournament report, I kind of enabled this person a little bit, and that was not great. So if you can be concrete about the actual things that someone has done that are against the rules, please do so, because I then talked with someone who was talking about the same player who said that they had been winning or losing to this person in round 3, but with so many resurrected Graveguard around the board that they were it was nearly impossible for them to lose in round 4. And this player played really, really slow and just made it so they never got to round 4, and then was like, oh, too bad, we don't get to finish our game, and took the win, when he even mentioned later, like, oh man, I probably would have lost that game. And then like during my match with him, he like mentioned that he would have lost round 1 if they hadn't run out of time. And yet he's a person who goes to time in every single game and clock hogs in every game. And so if his round 1 opponent had spoken to the TO and then I spoke to the TO, that would have been a real body of evidence that would have been actionable, right? Whereas if maybe it feels pointless if you talk to a TO and you're the only person who's ever complained about that person, and so they're probably not going to do much. But you never know how many other people have had bad interactions with this person, and it might come forward that actually a lot of people have had bad interactions with this person, and that you're not the only one, and that actually, like, I found that out to be true. And so it's worth saying something to the TO. It is their job to deal with the messy parts, and so that's why you should do it. And even if you haven't lawyered up, right, ideally you want to be concrete, but even if you can't be, that's okay. You should still say something if it didn't feel right. Finally, one of the best ways to do this without necessarily making people feel like they have to be sort of tattletales, whatever, is to include sports scores. And sports scores are so controversial, I think, in the wargaming community, and for good reason. I've kind of slowly come around to them in Warcry. For a long time, I didn't think they were necessary. And I still don't think, in a small community, I don't think sports scores are valuable because everybody knows each other. But a tournament with 20 players or more than 20 players should probably have them, because let me just kind of get through some of my pros and cons with it. I think a lot of the people watching this will actually have better opinions than I do on this. But for pros, I just think it makes it much easier to identify problematic actors in the community. If someone is consistently getting ones for their sports score, where you rate your opponent on 1 to 5 and you say what each one means. If someone is consistently getting ones, like, that should be a real red flag. And TOs can then use that to talk to someone like, hey man, this is your 3rd time coming to one of our tournaments. You keep getting, like, of your 4 games, 3 of your opponents give you a 1, man. Like, there's something going wrong. You could watch them play. You could then tell them that this is a real problem. And it also, it rewards lovable players, and it lets everybody know that this is something the community values, and that we value being good to each other and nice to each other, and that we might even give you a prize for being the goodest and nicest, right? I think that's really valuable. The cons, of course, other people have illuminated this more than I will, but it pressures you to kind of act like a clown to entertain your opponent. That part's not great. It also kind of punishes people who just don't have a lot of charisma. I don't know what really to say about that. I think, most people can tell the difference between someone who's just kind of boring compared to someone who's like actively playing in bad faith. And you can give someone a 1 or a 2 if you feel like legitimately mistreated by them, in a way that like the person who you don't feel mistreated by but just kind of bores you, you might not give a 1 or 2 to, but you might still not give a 5 to, and that's okay, right? It's not on that person to try to get a sports win, right? And so like if you say you can't win best overall if you don't win or get top in best sports, I think that can be a bit tough. But as far as just having a separate sports score rating, I don't think that needs to come into this. And then finally, 4 is just a really low sample size to base like a prize on, right? So if you don't want to give a big prize for sports score winner, that makes sense. But in general, I think the benefits really outweigh the positives as far as just being able to get feedback from people just to help protect the experience and to make it clear that the experience matters, that you care that people are being good opponents to their opponents, right? So that's kind of getting into some tougher topics in this, in this hobby. That's what I meant by, this is a very kind of high effort, low reward video. But I do think that this stuff is important. I think it's important as a community to have these conversations, and that's where I'm at with it. So I'll be back with some maybe less heavy videos in the future. And until then, may all your rolls be crits.